By this point, I think everybody understands that website speed really matters to your website and matters in a lot of contexts. It matters for SEO, but it also matters for conversions, for engagement, for user experience more generally. So in this video, let's talk about 5 proven ways that can help you improve your website's speed and performance. The first method that you can utilize is caching. Caching is a means of making your website load more effectively. The best way to understand caching is to think about how your website works when no caching is utilized. When no caching is utilized, every single time somebody comes to your website and requests a particular page from your website, your server has to do a lot of work. For every single request, your server has to go and query information from a database, and they have to get that information out of the database, and then they have to send that information to some code, and that code goes through and processes that information and decides how to output that information into the web page. And then your server takes the assembled web page and finally is able to send it to the browser. Now, without caching, your server has to do that every single time the page is requested, which can slow down the website's load for every single person coming to the website. Caching, though, allows the server to do all that work once. So only once the server has to go to the database and get all the information, and only once the server has to send that information through the code to assemble the page. And then that way, every time somebody comes to the site and requests that particular page, all the server has to do is just return the cached copy of that page. They don't have to do all the work to build the page because it's already built. And so caching really does speed up the website's speed and performance as a result because it saves a lot of work on the server. Now, you do want to make sure that that cache is refreshed on a somewhat regular interval to make sure that the information on the page is still fresh and relevant and not growing stale and outdated. But even if you refresh that page every 24 hours or every few hours, you're still making the website server work so much better. So how do you implement caching? Well, caching can be implemented in a few different ways depending on your particular configuration and server setup. Just as a quick example, I'll walk through how you can do this in WordPress. There's a number of different plugins you can use in WordPress that can help you add in caching. One I particularly like is WP Fastest Cache. WP Fastest Cache allows you to enable caching on your website with the click of a single checkbox. Worth noting is that once you've added in caching, you want to make sure to thoroughly test your website. Most of the time, there's no issues at all adding in caching to your website, but you do want to make sure that there are no problems that exist after you've enabled this. The next method that we can utilize to improve our website's speed and performance is compression and minification. Compression and minification are two different things, but they really go together, and we're trying to accomplish some of the same ideas. Let's start with compression. Compression means that you're compressing a really large file down to a smaller file size. If you've ever zipped something on your computer, you know how compression works. It takes a really large file and makes it into a smaller file. On the web, we're usually talking about 2 means of caching, Brotli compression and gzip compression. You can test if your website has either of these on giftofspeed.com. Plug in your website's URL and it will tell you if caching is enabled. It will also tell you how much your website is being compressed. In the case of Elementive's homepage, our compression percentage is 67%. Meaning that our original size file of 26K is reduced to only 8K, and an 8K file will load a lot faster into the browser than a 26K file. Next, we have minification. Minification is the process of minifying certain files and making the files that you do need to load into your website smaller. Typically, this is done by removing white space, comments, and extraneous code from JavaScript and CSS. There's a number of different tools you can use to help minify your CSS and JavaScript files, including minifier.org. Plug in your code, select the language, and then click minify, and you'll get the minified code that you can copy and paste in. You can also minify your CSS, JavaScript, and HTML in WP Fastest Cache as well if you happen to be using WordPress. Here again, if you minify or compress any of your files, make sure to thoroughly test out your website. Like with caching, most of the time, minifying and compressing don't cause any problems, they simply make your website load faster. But occasionally, minifying and compressing can cause things to break, so test it out and make sure that you don't have any problems. The third method we can use to improve our website speed is reducing images and image sizes. The first step is removing images you don't need. Determining which images you do and don't need can be tricky. There are certain images that you obviously need. Images that are part of the key or main content on a particular page, you need. Images that help convey information, you need. But what about decorative images? Are those needed? Well, decorative images can certainly help communicate your website's brand, or they can help make your page more interesting and engaging. In some cases, those decorative images can also help people convert on your website. But those decorative images also are going to slow down your website's speed and performance, and sometimes the way in which they slow down your website will actually hurt engagement, will actually hurt people's perception of your brand, will actually hurt your ability to convert more than decorative images help. So you need to step through each of those images and determine what the trade-offs are for your particular situation. In most cases, you probably want to remove as many images as possible to improve your website's speed. The next thing to think about when it comes to images is if images are sized appropriately. You don't want to load an image that's 1,000 pixels wide if it's only going to be displayed at 50 pixels wide on your web page. Make sure that you're loading things at the appropriate size. That way you're not loading something too unnecessarily large. And there's a number of different tools you can use to help you optimize images. PicMonkey, Pixlr, and GIMP are 3 of the more commonly recommended ones out there. The final part to think about with images is if you're using the right image file type. JPEGs are best for photographs and non-text graphics. PNGs are best for graphics with text and also for screenshots. GIF or GIF files are best for images with animation, and WebP files are an ideal replacement for PNG and JPEG files because they allow you to load an image at a smaller file size, and there is growing browser support for WebP files. The next area we can focus on to improve our website speed is fonts. Like images, fonts are really large files and can consume a lot of the time needed to load a particular page. So by removing fonts or reducing fonts, you can see pretty big gains in your website's speed. So the question becomes if you can remove fonts you don't need, and instead of using a custom font, you can use a browser default font. The problem is browser default fonts look like browser default fonts. They look kind of boring, they look kind of common, and not particularly interesting or engaging. I definitely encourage you to use browser default fonts where you can and try and do your best to make them look a little more interesting. There's certainly some good options out there to do that, but in some cases you are going to want to utilize custom fonts. In some cases you'll have to use custom fonts because that's really critical for your brand. You have a brand-specific font that you have to use. So in those cases, you want to make sure you're loading the fonts as effectively as possible. And one way you can do this is by preloading the fonts. This helps prioritize the way the font is loaded to the browser. The last area we'll discuss is optimizing third-party scripts. Third-party scripts are notorious for slowing down a website's speed. And unfortunately, it's not something under your control. By definition, this is a third-party script. It's controlled by somebody else. So you can't change caching or compress things or minify things. If those third-party scripts add in images that are too large, that's just too bad. If those third-party scripts add in a whole lot of fonts for a particular type of content that those third-party scripts are adding, too bad. You can't do anything about that either. But you do have some ability to control third-party scripts and how they're added to your particular page. It's not as much control as we have over the other areas, but at least it's some, and it can help improve your website's speed. By default, third-party scripts are typically render blocking, and that means that they have to load before everything else. They block the rendering of other items. So one way around this is you can try moving the script to the end of the page. By moving the script to the end of the page, you're hopefully making the browser load that last. That way everything else is able to load before this third-party script that blocks the rendering. It doesn't have anything else to block if it's loaded last. Unfortunately, doing this can sometimes break those third-party scripts. This is something you cannot do with analytics scripts because you don't want the analytics script to load last. You want the analytics script to load as early as possible. But if you load the analytics script as early as possible, which is good for reporting and tracking, that means that it's going to slow down the load of everything else. So another way that you can approach third-party scripts and modify them to hopefully improve your website speed is by adding async or defer tags. An async tag allows the script to load independent of the rest of the code being loaded on the website. it loads asynchronously against everything else happening on the website. Another tag you can add in are defer tags. A defer tag tells the browser that it doesn't have to wait for this script to finish loading before it loads in the remainder of the page. So it says to the browser, okay, you can defer this, you can wait on this one, go ahead and just load everything else. So it prevents that third-party script from being loaded. Now with async and with defer, you do need to make sure that that works with that third-party script. In some cases, this script simply can't load asynchronously, it simply can't be deferred, and you have to load it without these tags, and that is going to slow down your website speed. There's a lot that goes into improving your website speed. These 5 areas are the most common, and they do work really well to improve your website speed and performance, but they aren't the only 5 things that you'll need to think about to improve your website speed. So I want to leave you with 3 broad goals that you should keep in mind when working on your website speed and optimizing your website's performance. The first of those goals is you want to reduce how many files need to be loaded into the browser when a page is requested. If you're loading a page that only has 50 files, that's going to load faster than a page that has 1,000 files. So this is where removing unnecessary images, removing unnecessary fonts comes into play. You're simply taking away some of those additional files that have to be loaded. Similarly, you can look at third-party scripts and determine if those are really needed on a given page or not. And by pulling out that third-party script, you're reducing how many files need to be loaded for that particular page. The next goal to keep in mind is making the files that do have to be loaded to the page as small as possible. So this is where reducing image file sizes comes into play. You're making that image smaller. This is where compression comes into play. You're making the entire web page, the HTML, the JavaScript, the CSS, all of it smaller, compressing that down to a smaller size. Minifying plays into this as well. You're minifying your JavaScript and CSS files and making those a smaller file size. That way they are loaded into the page. The third and final goal to keep in mind when working on your website's speed is you want to make sure that you're loading everything as effectively as possible. Caching is a good example of this. By caching the files, you're preventing the server from having to do unnecessary work to build out a page. That makes the website load more effectively. With third-party scripts, adding async or defer tags can make those scripts load more effectively and instruct the browser to load those third-party scripts in a way that won't prevent the rendering of other items, that will allow the page to load more quickly. Another way of making your website load more effectively is by using the proper image sizes. If you're using PNGs instead of JPEGs, that's not going to be as effective. And if you're not using WebP files, then those images won't load as effectively either. If you have any questions about working with website speed or improving your website's performance, please let me know. You can email me at matthew@elementive.com. We have a lot of other videos on our channel about speed, including videos about Google's Core Web Vitals, so you may want to check those out as well. Thank you for watching.